McGiven. Morgan has talked about how you fit your offense to the personnel. As you've kind of surveyed this team, what do you feel like the strength of this team is, and where you want to design your offense around?
I think always first and foremost, I look at the skill set of the quarterbacks, and and so designing things that we feel like Devin can handle, that he can do well. Obviously integrating Bird into that, and what that package looks like for him, and what the volume looks like for him. And so I'm always going to look at those two components first. With the skill guys, a lot of different pieces there. So I think we can kind of mix and match some things, but utilizing two backs and what their different skill sets are. Especially with Wayshawn and Daniel Bray. They both bring some different elements and different skill sets where you can utilize them in different ways than other than just ball carriers. And then trying to look at the versatility of the wide receivers as well. Sometimes those guys are just wideouts, but there's guys that that you can put into a little bit different roles sometimes as well with the wideout groups, and still trying to formulate that to its fullest extent, but starting to get a better understanding now.
Coach Dev shared on Monday that he'll have the ability to kind of change things at the line of scrimmage, pretty simple stuff. But what has he done to earn your trust in doing that, and how do you kind of help develop that in him to make sure he's making the right decisions?
Yeah, just kind of always a slow process with that. Just making sure that he has command of the offense, and so as you go throughout spring, you just kind of integrate little things here and there. He's already exhibited, even in the two practices we've had up to this point, much better command of what's going on, and so he did some things in practice yesterday with some protection checks that were not anything that he did in the spring, and so he directed some things to handle some pressures in defense, and so we're giving him the keys to the car in that element. There's some different things on the perimeter with looks that he sees where he can get himself into the best situation based on the look that he's getting with route concepts and things like that. And so as we go and as he exhibits that command, we kind of put more on his plate in terms of taking control.
Last year, Devin said last year was probably the most banged up he's ever been in his career. I mean, had a multitude of injuries, but now he's fully back healthy. This is kind of a two-part question, so if you need me to rephrase, let me know.
It's good.
First, just how has his mentality kind of evolved over through the spring, coming off multiple injuries? And two, knowing how banged up he got last year, have you kind of catered the offense to kind of put him out of harm's way, given you have a plethora of receivers to go to now? How has that changed at all, if anything?
Yeah, I think my mindset wise, I haven't really seen much of a shift from spring to now, other than he just looks and he's moving, like he's healthy, but he's attacked all the practices. There hasn't been anything where he's really tried to hold back, or that you could see that he was still pushing through after the surgery in the off season and things like that. We tried to manage that in the spring as much as possible, and that now being full go, you can definitely see the comfort level just in when he gets out and he's on the perimeter and he opens up, then it looks like a little bit different depth than it did in the spring. What was the second part? Sorry.
Just given how banged up he was last
Yeah.
year, and now that the offense has so many weapons on the perimeter, does that change maybe run heavy versus maybe pass heavy?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say the run pass ratio. That can always change from week to week based on how you're trying to attack an opponent. But I think given the fact that we have weapons out there that we want to feature, then that could shift a little bit of the focus. I think what we tried to focus on in just with his development, knowing what he can do, has pushed him into that realm a little bit more, and then always sensitive to to how many hits the quarterback is going to take, whether it's how we're constructing our protection or what we're doing with him in the run game, and then also knowing how much he just creates on his own. And so, that's something we're going to have to manage. We're going to want to utilize his feet. We're going to want to create numbers in the run game, that the advantage that you can have when you involve some quarterback run game. I don't think we want to take that element of the offense away, but in terms of the hits and the types of hits that he's taking, definitely want to manage that.
Over the summer, Devin took the wide receivers down to Arizona with him to train. What have you seen from him as his growth in terms of the leadership, but also just what does that do with the connection with him and the receivers and what you're trying to build? And is that something that is common for a quarterback to take it to that level in the offseason?
They're always going to. I think guys are always going to put in work in the offseason, going to the extent where you take them down to Arizona and do something like that. Maybe not to that extent, but he is. I think by Coach Scally, myself, with Coach Gunderson, we've tried to push him into that leadership role, and guys are reacting to him, because of the type of player he is, and so he has influence that way. But just using his voice a little bit more influence, and then creating that connection, creating that chemistry. The chemistry is something that we're trying to build on a day-to-day basis with the team and the offense in its entirety. But he's been more vocal, and you can tell that there has been a connection that is starting to be established, or getting established with the work that they put in the offseason. And that manifests itself in practice the last couple of days also. There were, like I said before, he has the ability to change some things. And I want them to take ownership of the offense. I want them to kind of put their flavor on it. But he gave the receivers a check that we never talked about. So that was talked about sometime in their offseason training when they were together. And he saw something, and the receivers reacted to the check, and he threw a big play off of it, because of what he saw in attacking the coverage. And so, I just kind of looked over at Gundy and said, I don't know what you're teaching these guys, but that was kind of cool.
From the end of spring to now, where would you say the offense has made the biggest jump?
I just think I think from a cultural standpoint, there's a way we want it to look. There's an effort that they're giving on a down by down basis. That is something that has been established with the defense, prior to this year with Coach Scally, that he wanted to carry over and make it a team mentality in terms of the culture. And so we were really trying to push that. That was really coach driven in the spring, just getting that to show up on a play-by-play basis in terms of the consistency that we want. And so that is showing up way faster than it did in the spring. And so that culture piece of it is carried over. And then, in the first 2 days, two installs, and the first install kind of vanilla. And then we went from 0 to 100 in the second install with all the things that we're doing. But in the spring, that came as kind of a shock to him. Didn't handle it real well. There was, just the level of focus it took to execute that install. Yesterday, it was like clockwork. I mean, the way that they ripped through that thing, and there's always a lot of details, but how clean it looked from an operational standpoint was pretty impressive. The way they carried that over.
Last one, JD.
How do you feel like Bird's development, particularly as a passer, has been going so far this year?
Yeah, really well. We've pushed both him and Dev kind of the same way, in terms of becoming elite decision makers and having elite processing skills and being able to apply concepts to coverage, defensive looks, things like that. And so I would say Bird has made incremental progress, and again, early on in fall camp, that development through the spring is already showing up. And and I think where some of the tight windows that you would say quarterbacks are being a little bit risky, but as long as it's calculated risk, there's been some ball placement in the first couple of practices where you can tell he's much more comfortable ripping that in there because he knows what he's seeing, and it's not so reactive.
Thank you, Coach.
Yeah.